Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about missing the mark. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, what course of action would you take as a manager of if a project exceeds both the scheduled time and budget? Would you force your developers to work unpaid overtime, extend the project schedule, or drop some features? It depends on the contract. I don't think I've ever had a situation where I could, if I wanted to, force the developers to work overtime, and especially unpaid. I'm not sure if you can formulate a contract that way, and if you can, that would be, well, very weird for the developer, because every decent developer knows that it's basically impossible to say how much time something's going to take. It might happen at the management path or something like that, or where you have a specific project or like a consultancy or something like that. But it's usually not an option to just force the developers to work overtime. It's similar to, if you're gonna hire a construction firm, a bunch of people are going to work on your building, and can if the building isn't done within the time limit, can you force them to just basically work slave labor until it's done? No, as far as I have very little understanding of this area, but I've never really thought that was an option. But when it comes to extending the project schedules and the dropping of features, that's usually the path forward. That's usually what you have to do. So the thing that I usually try to do here is that I try to look at what's most feasible. I mean, most people treat the deadline as an absolute type of thing. I've never really seen that to be the case. I've never really seen a situation where, well, of course it has happened once or twice or so forth, but usually it's a fairly decent option to extend the project schedule. As I like to say, there are only every two. I have this phrase that I've heard. You may have heard me say a few times. The problem is what the problem is, and the idea behind that is, well, it's my own idea. I'm probably sure somebody else has thought of it as well. But what I mean when I say that the problem is what the problem is that there is no way for you to just magically fix a situation where the issue is going to, because you always have the same state. You have a problem that will take a certain amount of time, and given the resources or the constraint that you have, which means that your only option is always either you have to improve the speed at which you can work, and that usually means just either hire better people, have better tools, magically change the way how fast that you can do something. And that's usually, something that you will do if you can. And the other option is to reduce the size of the problem, because these are the only two options you ever have when dealing with anything in terms of issues that you have to resolve. Because if the problem is very simple, things will go faster. If it's a really difficult problem, but you have genius people or like amazing tools or something like that, then it's also going to go faster. But as I've said to many of my coworkers, or sometimes come and talk to me about that things are taking too long, or they feel like someone is underperforming, or etc., etc. And I always tell them the same thing. All right, yeah, maybe say this John or Jane isn't producing code as quickly as we want to. How do you want me to solve it? Because the only options I have is either to give them easier tasks so that their problem is easier to deal with, or we have to fire them and get somebody who's better. And during that time, you usually don't have anybody. So that is the conversation you always have. And it doesn't matter which project it is. It's always true that these are your two options. It's the same thing I say with people when you have some tough luck in your life. You only ever have two options. Either you sit and wait for the situation to change, or you have to get up and start moving in a direction and see what comes after, what happens later if you start doing things. And so the way that I would handle this is very simple. I would have to be in tune with what the stakes are, what features are critical, because usually dropping some features is fine. Taking shortcuts is also fine for most people when it comes down to either they don't get their software, or we have to descope some stuff that might not be as critical as everything else. And that usually solves the problem. It's very rare, I find, that you can't make this work, as I said. the difficult part comes when you have, and this happens sometimes, guys, if you're good at what you do and you have good people, usually the expectations are in tune, or are usually fairly aligned with what types of resources you have. The people that you have are usually able to hit the mark of like the timetable, you keep the schedule within reason. The usual times when you have a major issue is when you, as the person who's hiring people, or you as whoever is in charge, like the product manager, in my case that's going to be me, if I don't really know what's feasible to achieve and things take a lot longer and you don't get really any value, then you really can't do anything else than apologize that there's such a mismatch, or as I said, trade, like switch out people and so forth. And you probably heard about many people going through this, like projects where like a building just gets half finished because the money ran out too quickly, or things like that, or the firm that was responsible quit, or etc etc. Like there are these massive failures that happen, guys, and the idea behind having a good manager or a tech lead or so forth is that you are basically guaranteed that that's not going to happen, because you ideally want someone who really understands what is feasible, what resources you have, and what timetable that you can actually achieve. And those parts, all of them together, make up whether or not you're going to succeed with your project or not. So by just having an individual with that sort of experience, basically you have someone who can sort of look at things from an eagle eyes perspective, a holistic look, and see, for example, you're dealing with a fairly complicated problem, so you're probably going to need some seniors, or this is a fairly simple problem, so we can hire some juniors to deal with this, or so forth. Here are some features that are critical for the business, and here are some features that are nice to have, so you sort them based on how critical they are, etc etc. That's where you usually fix most of your issues. But when things really go poorly, the only thing you can really do is, as I said, either give people more time, because the problem is what the problem is, or reduce the size of the problem. So what I want you to take away from this is that I've never really heard that unpaid overtime is an option. If it is, then I suspect that that's the way that you would go. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get better code or anything like that, but it can, of course. I mean, as I said, my strong belief is that the problem is what the problem is, and so if you can increase your resources, or like how much progress you can make on a problem, that's one option. The other option is to either extend the time or reduce the size of the problem somehow. And the things that you are talking about, they're all options, and with which one you pick, well, it really comes down to your understanding of the situation, because sometimes it might be that you can actually extend the deadline, and that's usually the case if you ask me. And in many cases you have to drop some features. That's why I always give people the tip that if you're going to do this, make sure that you are making informed decisions, that you really understand sort of the scope, like prepare well so you know roughly how big the thing that you're going to build is and what type of developers you have on hand, because it doesn't do well. You're not going to do well if you have a really complicated problem but you don't have so good developers, for example. And when it comes to features, make sure that you always do a topological sort type of thing, where I personally like MVP style of working here. Try to order things in cadence of, like in the order of importance. So always work on the first thing that's going to ship value, make sure that that's done, and then pick the next thing and next thing. Always do that. Don't try to just build everything at the same time without any plan. Make sure that you're always shipping the most critical thing, because that way you are more likely to actually ship something rather than, as I was saying, leave a half-finished building without a roof or anything that has no value to anybody. Because even if you could just ship a roof and 3 walls, that's better than having a completely unusable space if you're building a building in this analogy. Have a great day.